Okay, I think we're ready. I'm ready. Is everybody else ready? Deborah's ready. Elia's ready. Jan's ready. Jan's always ready. Okay, that's the camera's the clue. Well, good evening. I'm Jim Schwartz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual meeting and program. A special thanks goes out to the Andrews family who generously sponsors our wonderful lecture series. My remarks are going to be brief this evening, so we can get to, which I know you're looking forward to, hearing our speaker this evening. I'm honored this evening to be installed as the board president for the third year for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. You know, time really flies when you're having fun. That's right. This year has been another year of many accomplishments, evidenced by the little reception we had for our volunteers before the meeting. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. But before we proceed with the programs, I thought I'd mention a few things that happened this year, for those of you that don't know what's been going on behind the scenes. Starting with the Andrews Family Lecture Series. This is the third this year. The first one worth mentioning is a program we had called From Silence to Recognition by Dr. Perry Brickman, which exposed the discrimination against Jewish dental school students at Emory University. That was fascinating. Then most recently, last month, we had a program called There's Jews in Texas, Growing Up in the Bible Belt. And that was a series of books, a presentation given by Dallas's own Deborah Weingarten, some of whom you might know their family. So that's a wonderful ongoing thing that the DJHS does. Is that Joe in the back? Hello, Joe. Good to see you. Others, we hired a new archivist, a professional archivist, amazing person. Where's Alexis? Is she still here?
She's upstairs.
Alexis Ferguson has done an unbelievable job in the 1 year that she's been here. She started with us in actually less than a year. In August, and if you haven't seen the archive in a while, you'd be amazed. She's also spearheading the push behind our volunteer program. We increased our membership significantly, especially our Trailblazer membership, which was a great thing. Obviously, members are what drive our organization. In case you haven't noticed, and if you're not a member, please take note of the envelope sitting on the chair by you, or you're on top of it. And if you're so moved, we would love to ask you to join our organization.
And if you'd like to renew.
And if you'd like to renew, our membership year is about to kick off again, so let's get started. We have this year begun a strategic planning process for the organization. It's been a long time since we've done that. There's a tremendous amount of energy that's come from this, and we are going to do some really, really great things as a result of the strategic planning. Janie Romaner and her colleague, David Sigalski, are leading this team. They've launched a new business together this year, and this is what they do. They consult with not-for-profit organizations and corporations in strategic planning, so we're very, very lucky to have them, and that's an initiative that began this year. We received our first grant for digitization of our photographic archive. That's a push that we are working toward. Eventually you'll be able to see much of our collection online. That's our dream, that's our vision, and we hope to see it happen much sooner than later. Volunteerism is way, way up. It's a focus. We can't do it all alone as a board or as a paid professional. We really rely heavily on our volunteer efforts. The volunteers we've had this year have done a lot to start to transfer our recorded archives, our oral histories, to digital format, to modern technology. As a matter of fact, we had some young people in here, and we were talking about converting from cassette to digital, and a kid raised his hand and said, "What's a cassette?" that was kind of fun and revealing. Our oral history committee has been very active this year. The number I have is we've done approximately 146 oral histories in this past year. Amazing. Again, someday soon, sooner than later, these interviews will be available online. So until then, you can make an appointment, come by and watch them if you're so inclined. We launched our weekly newsletter, electronic newsletter. If you're not getting that now, give us your email address and you'll be on the list. It's been fabulous. We sponsored, or we supported another team for the Kosher Chili Cook-Off this year, second year in a row. We didn't win. We were robbed, but we'll be there next year. We had a booth at the Israel Independence Day celebration. We're a co-sponsor of the JCC Film Festival. We were a co-sponsor of the JCC Book Fest. We participated last fall in North Texas Giving Day, raised over $3,800 for the organization, our first year doing that. There is finally a new website that we're starting to build, thanks to the efforts of our board member Scott Citron. Don't know when that's going to be available, when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. So it's very cool. So I'm quite excited about that. So I'd like to introduce the person that makes it all happen, Deborah Polsky, our executive director, to share a few thoughts with her report, and I'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to add only briefly to what Jim said. And our administrative assistant, Esther, who forgot to turn her phone on. So if you haven't done it yet, put your phones on silent so that you don't interrupt our speaker. I don't mind being interrupted so much. I really, last year we did a whole PowerPoint of our annual report, and I decided that you had enough to see tonight with our wonderful speaker and installing officers. So what I did was I made a very brief 4 pages. It's very small and simple. You are welcome to pick it up on your way out if you'd like to read a little more about what we've done. Really, I'd like to highlight only a couple of things. One is our oral history program. Under the guidance of our oral history committee, Pauline Revere, who could not be here tonight because she's away on a fabulous cruise, has led a team of volunteers, and we were fortunate that around this time last year, someone came to us, Scott Farber, who has his own website called generationslestweforget.com, and offered to help us because we had the same mission, which was to capture the stories of Dallas and Dallas Jewish history. And whether you lived in Dallas, your family was here for 150 years, or or you were here for 10 years or 20 years, or whatever, we wanted your story, and we still continue to want those stories. And in addition, we have a group of volunteers who take oral histories at other times as well. And as a result, as Jim said, we have done over 140 oral history interviews this year, which is remarkable. It's faster than we can keep up with it. A lot more of them are what they call born digital, so they're already in a digital format. They'll be up on our website faster. There are some already there. There are some on our YouTube channel. But we're very excited about that. We also have a project that several people, including our board member Joan Vermont and Esme Jacobson, brought to us to begin to do the same kind of program with the South African Jewish community here in Dallas. And so we trained a lot of volunteers, and we have done about 15 interviews so far, maybe a little more. We're hoping to increase that this year as we get our volunteers a little more motivated and our interviewees to say yes a little more frequently, even though they've already said yes. So we're very excited about that. In a year or so down the road, we're going to be able to move on and look at other groups who have come to Dallas as a group. Our goal is to be full participants in the Dallas Jewish community. We participated in the community scan. I went to a meeting, some wrap-up kind of stuff for the capital campaign last week. For those of you who remember the capital campaign, and if you haven't finished paying your pledges, keep paying it because our offices aren't paid for yet. We participate in Yom Ha'atzmaut, in Israel Independence Day. Every opportunity we get, including going out and speaking. This year alone, we've gone to Windsor Senior Living. I just did one for Adat Have Reams, Aleph, their first Havurah. We've spoken at a number of different places, and we're always happy to come and speak to a board meeting, a Havurah, a group of any kind. We're happy to come talk about almost any subject you can think of, but certainly about what we do here at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. So, having said that, I want to thank Jim, and I want to thank the outgoing board of directors, and look forward to the new incoming members. And I want to especially thank the staff because we could not do it without them. It's a fabulous job. I'm thrilled I have it. Mark asked me today in the car, how did you end up doing this? And I said, I just got lucky that my two passions for Jewish communal work and history came together, and I was in the right place at the right time. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back over to Jim.
Thank you, Deborah. So before we get to the one piece of business that we need to conduct and then our program, I just wanted to share a few thank yous. But before that, did anyone happen to see the AJC meeting this morning online that Hillary Clinton was on? Anybody? Anyone? No? Okay. There's a gentleman in the audience would like to hear what she had to say. If you did, see me afterwards, I'll make that introduction. Anyway, thank yous. The first thank yous are for our outgoing board members. There are two this evening. Elia Naxon and Sarah Yaron. Where's Sarah? Sarah, where are you? Ah, there you are. Thank you. You know, what can I say about these exceptional ladies? Your commitment to the Dallas Jewish Historical Society has been unwavering and impactful. It really has. You've led by example with your tireless energy, and it's really been something to marvel at. There is no way that mere words go far enough to express our appreciation for all you've done, all you've given to this organization. And we really want to say thank you so much. You are our family. We're not letting you leave so far. But in honor of what you've done, what you've given to this organization, we'd like to make a little remembrance. You've made donations in your honor. Elia, for you, to the Durable Medical Equipment Association.
Thank you.
An organization I know that's important to you. And to Sarah, our resident singer, to the Temple Emmanuel Music Fund. So thank you very much. To the current board members, thank you for your continued service. Volunteers are really what make this organization tick. And even though you're called a board member, you're still a volunteer. You give your time, and it's wonderful. And I'll do my best to live up to to the efforts that you put forth, and live up to this position of responsibility that I have as president. To our new board members, I really want to say sincerely thank you for agreeing to serve. I feel incredibly lucky for the second year in a row to have an exceptional group of new board members coming in. New blood, youthful, If I consider myself youthful, but new energy to bring to the group, and really looking forward to getting to know you as we work together to move this organization forward. To my executive board, Liz Leaner, Lori Ordaway, Stuart Rosenfield, and May Siebel, what an extraordinary group of leaders. You have helped stabilize and move this organization forward with a steady hand, and you're proven leaders, very talented. I'm very excited to work with you all again in the coming year. And finally, our executive director, Deborah Polsky. Deborah, you make it all come together. You do so much behind the scenes that no one sees. Every day you're doing something. You and I started this journey together, summer of 2012, but you really deserve the credit for how far we've come in the last 2 years. So thank you for making a difference to this organization. Just remember, you can't do it all. Leverage your time. So I'm going to take the next spot on the agenda too. Stuart Prescott, the chairman of our nominating committee, was going to make this presentation. Unfortunately, he had a family tragedy that just happened, and he can't be here tonight. So he asked me to step in his stead, which might be a little weird since I'm nominating myself, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. If there are no objections. Laurie, is that okay?
No objections.
No objections, okay. Gotta ask the lawyers. So anyway, it is my pleasure to present the slate of officers, directors, and new members for consideration for the 2014-2015 Dallas Jewish Historical Society Board of Directors. President Jim Schwartz, First Vice President Stuart Rosenfield, Second Vice President May Siebel, Liz Leaner, Secretary Lori Ordaway, Parliamentarian Andrea Weinstein, immediate past President. Board members Mark Anders, continuing board members, Mark Anders, Joan Vermont, Peggy Milheiser, Sarah Yaron, Michael Cohen, Harriet Gross, Scott Citron, Angela Horowitz, Sherry Roos, David Goldman, Hilton Jonas, Terry Sheps, Pauline Gravere, Esther Myers, and Ellen Ungerman. And our new board members, Sharon Fine, who is in New Jersey this evening, sends her regrets, Cliff Friedman, Neil Goldberg, Sharon Jason, who was not able to be here this evening, Deborah Konigsberg. Where's Deborah? There's Deborah. Hi, Deborah. Marilyn Paylett. Is Marilyn in the room? There's Marilyn. Hello.
Yeah.
Didn't say hello to you earlier. And Tammy Pringler,
Who could not be here.
who could not be here this evening. But we welcome them all. So I'm going to assume unanimous agreement among the board members, unless there's any objection. If you're a board member and you object, please raise your hand. Or member. That's right. If there's any objections to this slate, please let me know, or am I supposed to call for acceptance of this?
We can ask for calling of a unanimous ballot
Okay.
in favor of what's been
Is there a call for a
presented.
unanimous ballot? So moved. Second. I guess that's it, yes? All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Okay. Any objections? Any nays? All opposed? Done deal. Okay. So I'm not sure if there's an official speech that you give when you install a board member.
By the authority.
By the authority invested in me, I hereby install you as whoever's here to our board. We're a very formal group. It's part of what's fun about being part of this group. And for those of you that are coming off, I hereby uninstall you, but you're not getting away from us.
Yeah, I'm not getting it.
You just don't have an official title, okay? So, with that, I'd like to introduce our former board member, Elia Naxon, to come up in her last official duty as program chair to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
15 years, one job. All right. Where's our speaker? Oh, there he is. Okay. I need my glasses. I'm sorry. I thought I had them around my neck. Dr. Mark Bauman is the holder of master's degree studies from Lehigh University and University of Chicago, and a doctorate from Emory University in Atlanta. He taught at the College of William and Mary as a Mason's Fellow and received fellowships to conduct research at the American Jewish Archives. He is the author of several biographies, the author of the American Jewish Chronology, plus about 50 scholarly articles. He has edited Quiet Voices, Southern Rabbis and Civil Rights, The Dixie Diaspora, an anthology on Southern Jewish history. He serves as the founding and current editor of Southern Jewish History. He has received numerous distinguished awards in his field. He says he retired early as professor of history at Atlanta Metropolitan College. I suspect he was busy writing, researching, and editing and just couldn't fit in those classes. Am I right? He's done a remarkable job of representing and writing about us, the Southern Jewish community. As Dr. Bauman investigates individual as well as inter and intra-group behavior through the study of religious, ethnic, and immigrant minorities, what he's currently doing. We're delighted and excited to have him as a guest. I mean, just reading this, I had to really reduce it. It would have been twice as long. He says, keep it simple. We are delighted and excited to have him as our guest, a scholar, a writer, and a mensch.
Wow, what an introduction. I'd like to meet this guy. Actually,
Bring it up a little bit.
Thank you very, very much. When it comes down to it, it simply means I'm getting older. So you accumulate these things as you go along. I started to study Southern Jewish history about 35 years ago. And when I did, I started to read everything I can find in the field, which at that stage wasn't a huge amount. But one of the things I found was an article by a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College, Alan Krauss. Can you hear me? I'm looking at people. Okay. A rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College named Alan Krauss. He had interviewed about 14 Reform rabbis at the CCAR convention in Toronto, Canada in 1966. And he interviewed them specifically on their roles and their images of the civil rights movement in the South. Now, this was still in the middle of the movement. At that stage, now this goes all the way back to the 1960s, and I started researching in the late 1970s. The story amongst historians was that perhaps 10 or 12 rabbis in the South had been outspoken in favor of civil rights, okay? In the mid-1970s, I had already done an article of David Marks of Atlanta. I had done this in 1983. And I found that David Marks had been involved in civil rights after the Atlanta race riot of 1906. There was an interracial commission established, and he was a member of the interracial commission, and he had done some other things. Bobby Malone had done a dissertation that came out in book form of Max Heller of New Orleans. In the 1890s, there had been this horrific lynching. They were all horrible, but apparently this had involved really horrible things, and it made him change his position, and he came out in support of black rights and opposing lynching. This is in New Orleans in the 1890s. All right. So in the mid-1990s, I started to see something happening. I started to see there were a lot more rabbis involved in civil rights at a much earlier period of time than historians had realized. We had a conference in Memphis, the Southern Jewish Historical Society, around 1994, 1995. And a number of other historians gave papers treating Southern rabbis and civil rights. Out of that, I developed an anthology with Berkeley Kalin called Quiet Voices, Southern Rabbis and Civil Rights. It was a landmark at the time. About 7 or 8 years ago, I actually met Alan Krauss. I had done the introduction to the anthology, and I said the historiography, the historical study of the field, started with Alan Krauss. But all he had published was like one article, and then he disappeared. I don't like the way this looks. Okay. Yeah, this is better. Okay, you don't mind if I get away from all of my notes, do you? Okay. It had turned out that he had been a pulpit rabbi in California, and he had put off his historical research and study. And he was going to give a paper out of his research at the Southern Jewish Historical Society Conference, I think in Charleston. And I contacted him, and we became very good friends. And since then, I had him publish 2 articles in the journal, one on Sidney Padal of Charleston, and one on Benjamin Schultz of Mississippi. And we became very good friends, and I encouraged him to do something with these original interviews. And they were in terrible, terrible shape. And he wound up doing that. But unfortunately, Alan had cancer, and he was able to do a lot of his book, but at the end, he could not finish it. And when we met at Columbia about 2 years ago, he said if he could not finish it, would I finish it for him? And for the last 2 years, I've been working on completing his book. It's essentially the interviews with background. I've provided analysis and interpretation. And 2 days ago, I submitted it to the University of Alabama Press, and hopefully they're going to accept it and you'll be able to read more about it.
What is the name of the book?
Well, right now it doesn't have a name. Actually, the name I've tentatively given it is A Moment in Time. Because this really was a moment in time. When you think he's interviewing people in 1966, it's right in the middle of the civil rights movement. Certain of the things that would happen. For example, he interviewed Graffman in Birmingham before the Birmingham incident. He interviewed James Wax of Memphis before the sanitation worker strike. So it was really a fascinating moment in time to meet these people. And he told them for 25 years it would be confidential. And these interviews are tremendously powerful because these people were so tremendously honest to him. And in some cases, as far as I'm concerned, they shouldn't have been. They should have been hiding their positions. But at that stage, it wasn't us looking back at history 50 years ago. It was them living it then, so that they believed in their positions, even though today we could look back and say, boy, this guy was out of his mind. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try and give you conclusions from Alan's interviews, the analysis from that, going back to my book, Quiet Voices, Southern Rabbis and Civil Rights, and see where we stand. All right, now, to some extent, what I did was try and figure out if Alan's interviews were really representative of the experience of these rabbis in the South. He did not have rabbis from all of the different states. He only had Reform rabbis, okay? But the rabbis he had came from old-time Southern congregations, New South Southern congregations, small-town congregations, big city congregations. So he had the variety of different experiences. But what was more important to me in terms of were these representative figures is the points of view they expressed represented a whole spectrum of opinion. Because the rabbis in the South were far, far from unified. They were unified in certain areas. But in many areas, you know the story, you've got 2 Jews, you've got 3 opinions. That's exactly what you had. And sometimes they really despised each other because of their different positions. All right, so what do I find? Overwhelmingly, the rabbis who were most activist tended to follow rabbis who had been activists. Okay, so those rabbis had created a tradition in the community. Now I'm going to go back to Quiet Voices. You all know Hollis Weiner, Fort Worth? Well, this was one of her first projects as a historian. And she did an article on Sidney Wolfe of Corpus Christi. Okay, Corpus Christi. Yeah, the body of Moses. And a good friend of mine, Carl Price, had done an article on David Jacobson of San Antonio. And David Jacobson was preceded in San Antonio by Ephraim Frisch. And Frisch had made a reputation by supporting labor unions, even though his congregation was opposed to the labor unions. So you see where you had that tradition, one rabbi following another, it helped the second rabbi along because there was a tradition in the community that the rabbi was independent. Where you did not have that, for example in Birmingham, right? Bobby Malone did a biography of an earlier rabbi in Birmingham, and here my senior moment sets in. I'll remember his name in a few minutes. But the first rabbi was not outspoken when it came to black rights or labor union rights. So the rabbi who succeeded him, Milton Grafman, was anything but outspoken. So that tradition is very important. It's like having a role model before you, but it's also preparing your congregation and the community. And that's the next thing. These rabbis, if they were to succeed, had to prepare their communities. And this was something unconscious, because many of them had been in the communities for 5 and 10 years. So what was the preparation? They had established themselves within their congregations. They were good rabbis, not all of them. Some of them were weirdos who could not hold a pulpit. Harry Nussbaum in Jackson, Mississippi was an example of this. The Civil Rights Movement made his rabbinate. He was a failure as a rabbi. Okay? But for the most part, they established themselves within the congregations, and they served a role, a very typical role of the Reform rabbinate since the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. That was, they served as the ambassadors to the Gentiles. They were the Jewish voice to the Gentile community. They spoke to the Rotary Club. They joined ministerial associations. It might be one Reform rabbi, and usually was, but inevitably he was the vice president to the president of the ministerial association because he was their rabbi. He was the representative Jew. At times they would bring in the symphonies. They would bring in philanthropy. They would be concerned with the poor. Sometimes they would be concerned with handicapped individuals. What they did was establish their credentials within the community as someone who cared. So that when the Civil Rights Movement got in, the community was used to those rabbis speaking out as being a conscience of the community, even though the Jewish communities were tiny percentages of the overall population. There are Jews. There were Jews that were different, but they still are Jew. It was almost expected that the rabbi would be different. Right? Now, this is the Bible Belt. This is the South. So Jews in the South were Christ killers, but they were also the people of the book. So it was all right for the rabbi to be the prophet. We can ignore him. But we know that's the role he plays. Now, what I found is some of these rabbis were younger, some of them were older. But the vast majority of these rabbis were between 35 and 45 years old in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. They were established rabbis. They knew who they were. They were used to their congregations. They weren't going to back down. They had this image of the role of the rabbi as being the voice of the conscience of the community. That's important. Almost all of them were educated at Hebrew Union College. Now, you're all familiar with Hebrew Union College, I'm assuming. But Hebrew Union College was changing. It was changing from the classical reform from the first half of the 20th century and the late 19th century. In the 1920s and 30s, more and more of the children of the East European Jews who were brought up in traditional households entered Hebrew Union College. They were not afraid of tradition, and they tended to be pro-Zionist. The Reform movement, Hebrew Union College, had been anti-Zionist. So, many of these rabbis had parents, or they were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They fit this different image. In fact, some of them had more trouble with their congregations introducing Zionism to anti-Zionist congregations, or Hebrew and tradition into the congregation, than they did with their civil rights position. Now, almost all of them were chaplains. There were chaplains either during World War II or during the Korean War. This I found very informative and instructive because it meant they were used to giving orders, taking orders. They were officers. They were used to war experience. Not all of them had gone overseas. Jack Rothschild had been a rabbi in the Pacific during World War II. So they knew heroism and courage. And this was a war, obviously, for Jews against Hitler and racism. So that informed their background and experience. They were not just pulpit rabbis. They had also been chaplains during World War II, but during the Korean War. So all of these factors are fitting into their backgrounds and experiences to determine their future paths. Let's see. Other things in their background experience. Almost all of the congregations that they were in were old-time congregations going back to at least the mid-1800s. Many of them even before the Civil War. So you had established Jewish communities. Frequently, even in the small towns, the Jews were the merchants of the town and the community. But they were not the power structure. Okay? There were always the Jews. They were always marginalized, even though they might be in the Rotary Club, even though they would contribute to charity and be involved in the schools and everything. They were always Jews. They were always marginalized. Okay? But yet, relatively speaking, they were successful and they contributed to the community. So Jews were not new to these communities. It was typical for, everyone to be doing business with that. Okay, where do we go from here? I mentioned the spectrum of the approach of these different rabbis. At the far right of the spectrum is Benjamin Schultz of Mississippi. He is the only rabbi we know of to make statements to seem like he favored segregation and he opposed integration. It's anti-Semitic? Okay. All right. Before he passed away, Alan Krauss did an article on Schultz, and it was really fascinating because we assumed he was a Southern rabbi and it was racist. Okay? Turns out he's South, but he's South Brooklyn. Okay? He was from New York, and he had the reputation of being to the far right of Joseph McCarthy. He hated the communists. He really fought the communists to the point where he was not welcomed in the damn Yankee congregation. That's what brought him down to Mississippi. And when he gets down to Mississippi, you've got to realize, people in the South who opposed integration did not believe blacks led the movement. They believed it was Jew communists. So when he goes to Mississippi, he's told it's Jew communists. Blacks obviously were not intelligent enough to lead it. It must be the Jews. You realize the stereotypes? We're wealthy, but we're also communists? The irony of it. We can't win either way. In any case, he is told that the civil rights movement is not led by King. It's led by communists. So he opposes the civil rights movement because he's anti-communist. And he's very apologetic. He wants to make sure. I've got letters to Jake Marcus, a great historian at Hebrew Union College, where he says, I'm not a racist. I don't believe in integration. I'm just against the communists leading the civil rights movement. So that's the far right, straight from New York. Okay? Now, it's very important for us to place everything in perspective. I have told you we know of only one rabbi in the South who seemingly supported segregation. You cannot say that of any other religious group in the South other than maybe the Quakers, wherever they were. Okay? So if you compare that to the Methodists and the Baptists, where a large percentage of their ministers supported massive resistance, supported the Klan, it tells you where the Jews are in the South. They're part of the South, but not really part of the South. Okay? And that kind of describes Southern Jewish history. You're in the South, but not really of the South. You've got a Southern identity, but you're Jews, so that makes your Southern identity, whatever Southern identity means, different. Okay. So we're done with Ben Schultz. What shocked me, and I think the most important thing from these interviews, is a series of interviews with about 4 or 5 different rabbis who were, how can I put it? I'm going to call it gradualists. That's the easiest way to introduce this. Let me explain that in terms of the civil rights movement, there was an awful lot happening quietly behind the scenes in almost every community, gradually getting integration. So you could see progress without the marches and demonstrations. This was extremely true in Texas. All right? From what I've read about Texas, integration took place much more peacefully without the big marches and demonstrations here, for the most part. I'm sure you may have had some. But Texas seemed to be different. But you see, almost every community said it was different. But here you had big German background in the population and everything else. So it seemed a lot more moderate here than you have most places in the South. Levi Olin, yes. I knew someone would bring that up. Yes. I'm not going to go into that because you should know already and you can study it here. Besides, Hollis wrote that great book, Jewish Stars of Texas. Read more about it. Okay? In terms of the background of prejudice in Texas, you've got Raz Ben-Jad, who wrote an article for my journal on the KKK in Dallas. So you've got a big background here. So, you know, Jews were accepted in Dallas, but that didn't stop you from having a Klan. So this was the story. Okay, so let me go into these 4 or 5 rabbis. From their point of view, they did not want marches and demonstrations. They did not believe in that. Almost all the rabbis in the South did not believe in it. They wanted it gradually through behind-the-scenes work, but it becomes more complex. These rabbis apparently had almost no contact with any sort of educated blacks in their community. So they were extremely patronizing and condescending. They wanted it through the white power structure. So blacks shouldn't protest. Blacks should not resent the conditions they're in. Gradually, the whites in the community will do the right thing. You know, just wait for it. What I was shocked with was one of the people was this Milton Grafman in Birmingham. He makes an analogy. When Jews were discriminated against in Germany, This goes back to the 18-teens, 1820s, and 1830s. The German authorities, and this was typical in Europe, said, okay, we're going to do away with the Jewish problem. You know what the Jewish problem is? They exist. Okay? The prejudice, the persecution, the ghettos, that doesn't work. They're more Jewish. So what we're going to do, this actually comes out of John Locke and the Enlightenment, believe it or not. This is what the Enlightenment taught. If you allow them into secular society, if you force them to get secular educations, if you accept them, then don't worry, they'll assimilate. They'll go away. Okay. Now, but the condition for emancipation was accepting German culture, fitting into German society. So this Grafman points that out, that the Jews of Germany had to earn their freedom by showing they could be good Germans and secularize it. And then he turns around and says, well, that's what blacks should have to do too. I could have strangled the man. And he's been dead for 10 years. Okay? But that was the mentality. There was no sense. Milton Grafman was the only person, the only one of the rabbis who said, he's not doing this as a Jew, he's not doing it as a rabbi, he's doing it as a man. Now, remind me if I forget, and I probably will, we've got to deal with fear in the South, because that's the milieu. Okay. Grafman wanted to have it all sorts of ways. When people who supported segregation marched and demonstrated, he said, please don't do that. He signed a manifesto with the ministers saying, please stay out. We don't want that. Okay? When King wanted to go to Birmingham, Grafman is one of 8 ministers, he's the only rabbi, who writes to King and says, please stay away. We don't want the outside. You see, he was making it equal. In his convoluted conscience or convoluted moral system, the people who were racist were the equivalent to blacks who wanted rights. So King, you're familiar with the letter from Birmingham jail? Mm-hmm. Grafman was one of the people he wrote it to. So, and I could understand where King was coming from. But I could also understand to some extent where Grafman was coming from. See, conditions in Birmingham were thus. You had Bull Connor. But the people in Birmingham were pushing Bull Connor out. They changed their elections, and Bull Connor was on the way out. King had been in Albany, Georgia, and there was a total failure. There was a very good police chief there who said, okay, no police dogs, no hoses, no big news, very quiet. The Albany movement for King was a total failure. He needed success, which meant confrontation. King goes to Birmingham before Bull Connor leaves. He needed Bull Connor. So it gives you a certain amount of sympathy for Grafman's position here. Okay? So the confrontation was important and leads to national civil rights laws. Okay? From Grafman's point of view, if you had just left Birmingham alone, they gradually would have integrated. Now, I'm not sure what gradually takes. That might have been still doing it today. That's the problem with Grafman's approach. Okay, so you've got rabbis like Grafman, Martin Hinchin, who were these gradualists in a very paternalistic fashion that said, you know, blacks should not march and demonstrate. What we should do is, we know the problem, let's just handle it within the white power structure. Then you have a group of rabbis, and this is the one that's growing, and the reason it's growing is because we're learning more and more about these people. Some of them were extremely well known. Jack Rothschild in Atlanta, Perry Nussbaum in Jackson, Mississippi. The best known and the most heroic was Charles Manton Band in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Can you imagine being in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and speaking up in favor of the black rights, and being the head of the Mississippi Humanities Commission, trying to get integration in Mississippi in the 1950s? That's heroic. Okay? Now, Nussbaum's an interesting case. Someone was supposed to remind me about talking about fear. You all flunked. You didn't remind me. Okay. Now it's your job to remind me to come back to Nussbaum, okay? The environment in which the Jews in the South lived, and the environment in which these rabbis had to negotiate the relationship with their congregations, was one of abject fear. Again, we've got Roz with her article on the Klan going back to the 20s and 30s. But the fear was of a couple of things. One was violence, and the other was finances, boycotts. If you were a Jewish department store owner and you're the first one to have blacks sit down and eat at your lunch counter, or allow the women to dry on clothes, or have integrated bathrooms, will you totally lose your white clientele? This was a very, very strong fear. Besides the fact, in most places, it was illegal to do these things. So they've got to deal with the legal system besides the economic things. I know you all remember, I've been here once before. About 10 or 12 years ago, I gave the Pullen lecture. And I did it, you all remember, it was on Southern Jewish women in their social organizations. Right? And I know you remember, one of the things I may have mentioned then, although I've reiterated and strengthened it since then, is in the South, the people who tended to speak out were the rabbis, Reform rabbis, and women. Because the women were not afraid of losing the jobs and the businesses. And they were women. They felt shielded from the persecution. Their husbands could be beaten, but in the South you weren't going to beat up the women. Jewish women are deeply involved throughout the South in Save Our Schools type organizations, where it was America closing down schools, and these women said, no, do not close down the schools. We cannot have that as the educational system. So women are deeply involved, and Jewish women participate with non-Jewish women in these organizations. Okay. Was the fear pure paranoia? No, it was not. Between 1956 and 1960, a series of temples and a series of JCCs were bombed throughout the South. Places like Nashville, Atlanta, Anniston, Alabama, Miami, okay? There was, no, the temple in Birmingham was not bombed. That was the church in Birmingham, not the temple. Like the Grafton, there was no reason to bomb the temple with Grafton there. Okay. In any case, a key individual here is Perry Nussbaum. Perry Nussbaum was really berated by Manton-Band. Manton-Band said, where are you, Perry Nussbaum? Okay. Nussbaum was very fearful and was not outspoken. But when the temple in Atlanta was bombed in 1958, Nussbaum said, if it can happen in Atlanta, it could happen any place. You can't be safe, so you might as well speak out. So Nussbaum starts to speak out. And you know, we had a lot of Northerners coming down for Freedom Summer and to integrate the transportation, the bus system and things like that. The highest percentage of whites amongst those demonstrators were Jews. Huge percentage of Jews amongst the white civil rights leaders who come to the South. Okay? Tremendously so. A number of these, when they went to Mississippi, were put in Parchman Penitentiary. Parchman Penitentiary has a terrible, terrible reputation. Perry Nussbaum very quietly visited those people, young people, marchers and demonstrators. And he communicated with their families to say they're all right, they're all right, they're all right. He asked the other rabbis in Mississippi to do it with him, especially the rabbis that were closer to Parchment. They refused. Okay? But you see, some of these rabbis took the nudge to get them involved, and that's what you had there. Okay. Now, a number of these rabbis come up to about other rabbis. Obviously, they all hated Schultz. I mean, Schultz was like a renegade here. Send him back to New York where he belongs. But they also don't like the rabbi in Montgomery, a man named Blackschlager. And that's because Blackschlager said, I'm not going to speak out because I'm afraid of losing my job. And the rabbis who spoke out said, then what is the meaning of your job? Okay, so I don't know what I do in the same circumstance, so it's hard for me to criticize. And one of the rabbis, I think Malcolm Stern, who was in Norfolk at the time, said, you know, this is my friend, and I understand his position. What would you do in Montgomery, Alabama? I mean, Perry Nussbaum's temple was bombed, but so was his home. All right, so can you imagine in Montgomery, Alabama, you would not last very long there. So there was a certain amount of understanding. What shocked me, though, is that you had a rabbi named Emmett Frank in Alexandria, Virginia. Southern congressmen were elected over and over and over again, and they profited from the seniority system. And one of the more powerful ones was a man named Byrd. He had the Byrd machine in Virginia. And these Southern politicians supported massive resistance. They come out with a congressional manifesto in the mid-1950s saying, we will not support the Supreme Court Brown decision. Impeach the federal Supreme Court. Okay? Yeah. Some of those become famous later on with Watergate as big heroes. Okay, Sam Ervin, North Carolina. Congressional manifesto, but with Watergate, he was a hero. But in any case, I've lost my train of thought. Okay. Emmett Frank attacks Byrd. But he attacks Byrd in very personal terms. And the other rabbis, this surprised me, this had not been known before, criticized Frank. Because they said, you have to deal with these people. And if you make it personal, you harden their position. They may be racist, they may be pro-segregation, but you have to be able to deal with them and negotiate with them. So it's very fascinating. They didn't like Schultz, they didn't like Blackschlager, but they also didn't like Emmett Frank. Because all of these rabbis overwhelmingly said, we want to work quietly behind the scenes. Okay? We don't like the marches and demonstrations. But I was corrected. We had a meeting in Birmingham. One of the people there was Irene Palnick. Her husband was Zeke Palnick. He starts off and helps integrate the University of Alabama. And then he becomes a key civil rights rabbi in Arkansas. And she said, Zeke Palnick liked the marches and demonstrations. And the reason for that is they looked so radical when they left, he looked like a moderate. So an awful lot of this was strategizing. The rabbis love to work through ministerial associations. Why? Jews are such a tiny minority. It's not the Jews you got to convince. It's the Methodists and the Baptists and the Episcopalians. Okay? So if you could get the Ministers Association behind this, peaceful integration, don't fight the Supreme Court, just obey the law of the land. Notice that's not terribly radical. Just support the law of the land. That's all they were saying. In Atlanta in the 1956, Jacob Rothschild writes the Ministerial Association manifesto, but refuses to sign it. He says you got to have this coming from Jesus Christ. That's what you've got to do. It's got to be from Jesus Christ. It's got to be from the Christian perspective. So I can't sign that. So he was in the forefront of having the Christians come out. So all of this comes around and around and around. The rabbis in the South do not particularly like northern rabbis and national Jewish organizations in terms of coming to the South. They really didn't like it. They resented it. And the degree of the resentment, I didn't realize until I started to read this stuff. Perry Nussbaum says, they don't care, the national Jewish organizations don't care about what happens to the Jews in the South because they're interested in fundraising and membership. And the Jewish population in the South is so small, they would far prefer raising the money in Boston and Chicago and Philadelphia. And they can do that by being civil rights heroes. And the heck with the Jewish communities locally. I was surprised to get that from Nussbaum. So what you had, and the rabbis, some of the rabbis from the north come down and march and demonstrate. And some of them go to jail, some of them are actually beaten. But usually they have for the weekend and they go back to the home congregations. Big heroes. Inevitably, they had not spoken to the local rabbi. They could care less about the local Jewish population, but they became big heroes. So these rabbis, these fly-in rabbis, were tremendously resented by the local Jewish communities, to the point where some of them stopped giving donations and membership in the National Jewish Organization. So what you're seeing here is all sorts of different nuance, all sorts of different beliefs that's really hard to believe. It's really a very, very complicated picture. Okay. Now, the question remains, did these rabbis who did speak out make a difference? Interesting question. I would have to ask, sir, that in terms of the broad civil rights movement, if no Jew in the South had lived, you still would have had the civil rights movement. Let's face it was the marches and demonstrations that got Congress to pass laws. Okay? It was blacks leading the movement. Without black leadership, without the black movement, you would not have had the civil rights movement. But yet, you had to change white public opinion. And you had groups within the South. When I was a graduate student at Emory, I happened to work for the library, and I was doing the Ralph McGill collection. Ralph McGill was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. When that church, the Fifth Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, was bombed and the temple was bombed, he came out with an editorial that won him the Pulitzer Prize, A Church, a School. Okay? He was called Pappy McGill, and he had a series of Southern editors, white editors of newspapers, who called for gradual integration, acceptance of the Supreme Court, and ultimately black rights. They influenced public opinion. These rabbis influenced public opinion. They became consciences of the community and consciences of their congregations. Some of the congregations gave them hard times. But if the rabbi was accepted, if the rabbi had, done his background, was accepted in the congregation, they might give him a hard time. They might say, do not speak out without the board's approval. And the rabbis inevitably say, no, this is a free pulpit. And they go along. Where you've got the rabbis that do not do well, they have their contracts not renewed, they're pressured to leave. Again, I come back to Alan Krauss. He did that article on Padol of Charleston. We always pushed that into his Charleston congregation. But what Alan found is it's because he really didn't establish himself within the community. He wasn't a good pastoral rabbi. He wasn't a good congregational rabbi. So it was like, that was the last straw. And that's what you got to do. You've got to establish yourself as a rabbi in the community. And then you could speak out. but that's a gradual process. Okay, I can go on, but I think it's time. I think I'm getting the evil eye. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know that the information is all about Reform rabbis. What do you know about the rest of the rabbis?
That's a very good question. I'm very happy you brought it up. Very, very little. I did a book, a biography of Harry Epstein of Atlanta. In the 1920s and 1930s, he's what was called a modern Orthodox rabbi. But he, like other rabbis, led his congregation into the conservative movement just before towards the end, after World War II. In this case, in 1952, it becomes a conservative congregation. And this is in Atlanta. He gives sermons. He'll talk about the civil rights movement and the high holidays. He does certain things, but I had interviewed him before he passed away for the book, and he said he didn't do very much. And from that, I drew the conclusion, and I think this is widely accepted, that Orthodox and conservative rabbis had a different mission. Going back to that Pittsburgh platform of the Reform movement, the Reform movement did not stress tradition and Hebrew. It was anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. It stressed social justice, prophetic Judaism. So what these rabbis, the Reform rabbis, were doing was Reform Judaism. In terms of the mission of the Orthodox and conservative rabbis, for the most part in the 1940s and 50s, they were dealing with first-generation East European immigrants and their children. They perceived their job not outreach as ambassadors to the Gentiles, but their job was to keep Jews in Judaism. Okay? And they figured, all right, we can't keep the children in Orthodoxy. If we can keep them within conservatism, at least they're not Goyish or Reform. Okay. Now, as I say this, notice I prefaced it by saying we don't know enough. We do know there's an article in my journal by Mary Stanton on the civil rights movement in Montgomery. There's a rabbi there named Seymour Atlas, who last I heard was still alive in Florida. Must be almost 100 now. And here's an Orthodox rabbi who did speak out on civil rights in Montgomery. Okay. We have a conservative rabbi in Memphis, and you're going to, please, senior moment, I don't remember his name. He actually marches and demonstrates, which was highly unusual. You had the conservative rabbis meeting, and they said, well, let's fly down for the weekend and march and demonstrate, and he participated. And I meant to look it up, and I couldn't find it. I was shocked, but there was also a conservative rabbi from Texas. And I don't remember if it's Kahana or something like that. I was trying to remember his name.
Meyer Kahana.
Yeah, and he was conservative, and he actually marched and demonstrated with those conservative rabbis. So you do have these stories coming out. So what I'm getting at is historians have not done their job. In the same way, when I started out, maybe 10 or 15 rabbis were involved in civil rights. Now I realize probably the majority of Reform rabbis were involved in one way or another. My guess is as we delve into the conservative and Orthodox rabbinate, we will find more and more of those people involved in greater or lesser degree. It's just that we haven't done the research. And one other thing. Southern Jewish history has been tended to be viewed as German Reform Jewish history, and that's totally wrong.
Right.
So it's partly the prejudices of historians in the last 35 years. So we need more research. But if you do the research, I'd be happy to accept the article from my journal. Excuse me, go ahead.
Of all the rabbis that you described who were important in this, how many of them were native Southerners?
Excellent question. Something else I had forgotten about, so I'm really happy you asked that. A small percentage of them were native Southerners. Okay, some of them were born in places like Mississippi and stuff like that. But what I found more interesting is that almost all of them had experience in the South. And this is because Hebrew Union College has its students serve in congregations, especially small congregations without rabbis or for the high holidays. So I would say a majority of these rabbis who were outspoken, even the ones that weren't, had experience in the South and in Southern congregations before their big pulpit times.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that way. And the other thing that's curious is that I found a couple of them were born in Canada. And again, this is something that hasn't been researched. So it's something work in progress.
You talked about fear. How much of the legacy of Leo Frank impacted the fear of Southern Jewish people?
You all familiar with the Leo Frank case?
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
Quickly.
In 1913, a young girl who works in this pencil factory in Atlanta is brutally murdered. Okay? All the evidence points to a black janitor, but the police wind up accusing the Jewish manager. Now, the Jewish manager symbolized a variety of different things. New York, he was educated at Cornell, the factory system in the South, where you had all these poor white girls coming in at very early ages and they were being exploited. So they trump up the charges and they convict Leo Frank of murdering her. And this was extremely unusual, but it tells you the place of the Jews in the South. This is really in the center of the Jim Crow racist era. But Jim Conley, the black janitor's testimony was used against him. He might have been white, but he was Jewish, so he was like an in-between race, Leo Frank was. The governor, who had close ties to the Jewish community, investigated the evidence and found Leo Frank was not guilty. And Leo Frank had been found guilty. He doesn't want a total riot, so he says, all right, I'm going to commute your sentence to life in prison. This was the end of his governorship. People actually march on the governor's mansion in Atlanta. But a group of people, someone said they just come back from Marietta. The young girl was from Marietta. So a group of prominent citizens from Marietta go to the penitentiary in Milledgeville, take Leo Frank out without firing a shot, bring him all the way back to Marietta and hang him. So I'd love to say this is a total aberration, but it's not. There was violence against Jews in the South and in the United States. Okay? But this is the only case we have in American history where he was convicted legally and he was lynched after he was convicted legally.
How old was he?
I don't know exactly. He was a young man. He was probably in his 30s, I would guess. All right. But in any case, it really shocks the Atlanta Jewish community, because the Atlanta Jewish community felt totally acceptable in 1915. And they really turned inward as a result of that. And even as late as like 5 and 10 years ago, there were Jews in Atlanta, the old-timers, who did not want to talk about the Leo Frank case. They didn't want an exhibit on the Leo Frank case. They didn't want Steve Oney's terrific book on the Leo Frank case. They wanted it all hushed up. So the Leo Frank case has a huge impact. But you remember I said it's not a total aberration. You had all sorts of incidents of anti-Semitism in the South, the way you did nationally. So the Leo Frank case is by far the most dramatic. But you had this environment where Jews in the South were always like accepted aliens, marginalized, whatever way you want to put it. They were there, but they were always different. for the most part, and this was national and international, Jews were actually considered a separate race. Somewhere in between. Go ahead.
Last question.
I don't really see that happening in Dallas, truthfully, between the Sangers and the Marcuses.
Again, I think Texas was very different. She said she doesn't think it happened so much in Dallas with the Sangers and the Marcuses. Again, Raz will tell you about the KKK in the 1920s here, and 1930s here. Okay, but again, I think Texas is really sort of weird. We're not sure if it's southern or western. It's really Texan. It's got a strong German population that came from Germany with the Revolution of 1848 that tended to be anti-slavery. So Texas is not nearly as violent as you would have in Alabama or Mississippi or places like that. It is different. Or North Carolina.
But even here, because we did a lot of research, and when Roz and Harriet were writing their paper, we did, looked at a lot of the articles that had been written and things like that, and there was very much, at least for a long time, friends by day, but not after 6 o'clock.
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock. Jews didn't mix after 5 o'clock, and although there were people like the Marcuses and Fred Florence and the Sangers, people who sat on the city council and things like that, there was never any question, from what I've been reading, that they were the Jewish member on the city council. They weren't, even though they were pretty assimilated, they were, they were still in everybody's minds.
In the mid-1980s, I did a panel interview, and one of the people I interviewed was Erwin Zabin, a multimillionaire, the head of a Fortune 500 company at the time. Now he's deceased, but Zabin Park is the JCC thing in Atlanta. He was the head of National Service Industries, and he's the one that introduced me to the 5 o'clock shout-out. Can you imagine the head of a Fortune 500 company, a multimillionaire, and he says, in the mid-1980s, there's no socializing. You still have the Piedmont Driving Club. You still had exclusive clubs in Atlanta, as you did almost everywhere, that did not accept Jews. You still had, going all the way into the 1940s and 50s, residential segregation, where Jews could not go into certain communities.
And it happened in Dallas, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dallas Country Club. You could not even buy a lot.
That's right.
It's all yours.
Thank you so much. Was everything that we hoped it would be. Thank you so much for attending and coming to our annual meeting. We hope that you will consider membership if you've not been a member, renew your membership if you have been a member. We do have a few books and videos outside for sale. There's a little coffee and not much food left, but you're welcome to what's there. Thank you so much for coming.
Give it only on induction. Oh, that's, yeah, I said I would act as consultant, whatever they want. I'm not drunk. How you doing? I'm so glad you came. I love that. I love that.
I don't know her name. Navy Blue. She's with Joe. Mickey and Joe. Mickey. I don't know. I can't see her. She's back. Oh, she's by the cookies and she's wearing navy blue. She has blonde hair. Well, she just turned 80 last week. I know what it is. Mickey and Joe. Something simple brown about
Then they start to tell you all different stories. Well, this one would not probably come out even for another year.
I actually have a friend who's father,
You enjoy playing voices.
and he said they go out of
This
it.
one, I hope so too. Thank you.
Because they just do it to be annoying. Thanks so much. Good. We're very happy to have you. Jim speaks very highly. Nice to meet you. Very interesting.
Let me ask you, on your oral histories, do you do the old folks' homes? Are you making
We have done a few here and there. We have not made a big sweep, but we're thinking during the summer that's what we're going to do.
You know, I go to the local Legacy. I do a book thing there every week.
To Legacy? To Preston Hollow? Yeah.